African sports, safeguarding, inclusion, and accountability. My name is Khairan Noor. I'm the chairperson of the East Africa Law Society Sports Law Committee, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. And before we begin, just a quick few notes. This session is being recorded, and of course, please keep your microphones muted unless you're invited to speak. Share your questions in the chat at any time. We'll address them in the Q&A segment. And now, let's set the stage for why we're here today. So, just as a background and as an introduction to our topic today, and I would like to maybe offer this few thoughts from my part. African sport is full of moments that inspire. Starting from a teenage footballer signing his or her first contract, a runner smashing records, and a team lifting a trophy that unites a nation. But behind these moments, there are too many untold stories. And these stories, encompass issues such as exploitation, abuse, discrimination, and corruption. And when we talk about safeguarding, our instinct is often to focus on children. And yes, protecting children in sport is non-negotiable, but they're also not only the part of the picture. So when you talk about safeguarding, we must be inclusive by design in covering women, for one, who face harassment, unequal opportunities, and systemic barriers. Persons with disabilities, often excluded by lack of accessibility or adapted facilities. Adults at risk, such as migrant athletes or coaches on precarious contracts. Minority groups who may experience discrimination based on religion, ethnicity, or identity. And of course, not forgetting officials, referees, and volunteers who are also vulnerable to abuse. And the truth is, too many policies in African sport focus narrowly on children protection and overlook others at risk, such as other stakeholders. And this is not just a technical gap, it is a moral one. And just to highlight one of the major events that we're anticipating to have soon, with the AFCON 2027 on the horizon, we have a rare chance to set the gold standard for human rights in sport before a scandal forces change. And that requires governance that works, safeguarding that is enforced, and inclusion that is lived, not just written in policy. And today's panel is not just about raising awareness, it's also about building solutions, and you have the right people here to help us today. And of course, joining us on this panel, we have Ms. Caroline Mwanzia. She's an international sports lawyer and FIFA agent. She's going to speak on ethical governance and accountability in sports bodies. We also have Mr. Anthony Atata, a partner at Holbach Law Firm, and he's going to cover or speak on human rights and mega events, generally picking on the lessons from African-hosted tournaments. We have Mr. Timothy Kaja, an associate partner from Ngoru Mutebi Advocates, and is going to speak on gender discrimination and advancing equity in African sports. And lastly, we're joined by Ms. Sarah Ochwada, the Vice Chair and Judge of FIFA Football Tribunal, also partner of Snow Legal. She's going to speak on athlete welfare and legal safeguarding frameworks. So we're going to start with Ms. Caroline. And just as we open the stage for you, Caroline, we know governance is often where the success or failure of safeguarding really begins. So the floor is yours. Allow me to project Ms. Caroline's slides. In the meantime, she can maybe speak more about herself and what she does and where she's from.
Thank you so much, Ryan. As already introduced to everyone, good afternoon, good evening, good morning from wherever you are. My name is Caroline Mwanzia. I am a sports lawyer from Kenya. I currently practice in Nairobi, and my areas of practice mainly touch on safeguarding and anti-doping, general sports governance, anything about contracts and agency, as we've already been told. I am also a sitting disciplinary tribunal member of World Athletics Safeguarding, and there we deal with issues of safeguarding strictly. I am an ad hoc clerk with the Court of Arbitration for Sports, specifically in the anti-doping division. As already told, I am a licensed football FIFA agent. And finally, I am pleased to be here. So I will touch on ethical governance and accountability in sports. Today's slides are few because I don't intend to take a long time. I'm just briefly introducing you on everything governance within the context of sports. So the slides are on, I think on my end, I can see them, Hiram. Yes, so what is governance? Basically, governance in sports covers a multitude of topics, including accountability, transparency, fairness of process, everything within the ambit of sports. And sports bodies are required to operate within certain parameters and acceptable conduct, and their aim is to enhance ethics in sports. So, when you talk about sports governance, we're talking about activities within the context of sport that are meant to ensure that accountability and transparency have been maintained at the very least, fairness of process, and many other topical issues. So we have sports bodies all over the world, starting from the international level, then we go to the regional level, then we go to the local level. And all these cadres of sports bodies are meant to ensure that accountability is maintained in all the steps. So that is why we have, for instance, you'll see you have FIFA in the international level, then you come to the regional level, Africa, we have CAF, the Confederation of African Football, and then now you come locally to Kenya, for instance. I know we have other members who are not from Kenya, but I'll use Kenyan examples. We have then FKF, Federation of Kenyan Football. And so all these bodies are there so that we have accountability from the lowest level all the way to the highest level. And integrity in sport is a major principle that we need to encompass when we talk about sports governance, all with the aim of ensuring process is fair and processes are done in a fair manner. And sports organizations are expected to hold the highest level of accountability by establishing structures and policies for smooth operation. So what that means is when you talk about governance generally, and of course the conversation deals with also ethical governance, so we'll talk about issues of safeguarding later on and human rights generally. And so how accountability is maintained within the context of sports is through establishing structures and policies which will then ensure that processes are run in a smooth and fair manner. Slides next, Hiran. So what I mean when I talk about encompassing policies and structures to ensure smooth running, we talk about bodies establishing structures like the rules of sport, rules of sports eligibility criteria, regulations on anti-doping and safeguarding, everything about finances and whatnot, which I think we'll touch on this on the next slide. And so national and international sport bodies have different roles and responsibilities, and their mandate is to promote sport, of course, among every other mandate. I gave examples of the IOC for the Olympics, I gave FIFA for football, and AK, of course, Athletics Kenya now when you come down to the national level, which is Kenya. These bodies have within their structures established the office, the responsibilities of officials, the rules of the game, the criteria for selecting teams and whatnot, the legal regulations such as dispute resolution, and then national sport bodies, to be specific, are expected to have these policies. I wouldn't expect that a national sport body is running without any document that explains how they should run their processes. And these policies have in them the ways in which they should operate and the consequences thereof of not complying with the steps. And so all this covers issues of governance because you have to be held accountable as a sport body, and there has to be processes that have been set aside for persons to understand what happens in the event that you don't comply with these processes. And this is to ensure that we are able to hold a particular office accountable for not doing a particular for not taking up a responsibility that they were supposed to take as described in the policy. And so for the federations falling under the umbrella national body, we have, when I say federation falling under the umbrella national body, I mean you have, for instance, the Kenya National Paralympic Committee. And then you find that under the Paralympic Committee, of course, that's our national body. If you look at the regional, or rather the international, we have the IPC, which is the International Paralympic Committee. So umbrella federations also fall under such committees, such international and national committees. And so, for instance, in Kenya, we have the KNPC, but underneath we have like the cerebral palsy, mentally handicapped, amputees, and whatnot. So such sub-federations that fall under the major umbrella body are also expected to have policies and structures in which they can run the sport. And that also touches on governance. So they're expected to have the constitution, they're expected to have policies on anti-doping, policies on safeguarding, and legal regulations thereafter. So these regulations should include modes of financial accounting as well, because one way in which we hold sport bodies accountable is through how they make use of the money that has been given upon them. And so regular audits need to be done, and regular accounting and proper books of account need to be put aside so that we are able to understand how they have been going about their finances. Then how do they go through their regular meetings? Hiram, there's an echo. So how they go about this accountability, for instance, is through AGMs and SGMs. AGMs, I mean annual general meeting, and special meetings. These meetings are necessary so that sports bodies are able to have accountability and transparency of process. If you don't hold meetings regularly as sports bodies, then the issue of holding particular people accountable or particular departments accountable will be lost. And so these meetings are there in the constitution or in the policies so that the members are aware that every once in a while we need to sit down and have agreements on how to run the affairs of this body. And so other topical issues, of course, and very timely, that need to be covered in the context of governance are issues of gender equality, non-discrimination, disability inclusion within the sport and the administration. These are issues that they have to be included when you talk about sports governance generally, because they also touch on ethical conduct of particular persons within sport. So we need to have people within the office maintaining the two-thirds gender rule, for instance, and also including persons with disability into the office as well, so that we have a very fair process. Then finally, they need to have compliance and enforcement mechanisms in them to ensure that the sport body has an organized system where all disputes are handled and they're addressed. So sport bodies need to have an internal dispute resolution mechanism, for instance, before they take their and channel their disputes to a particular sports deciding body, like the Sports Disputes Tribunal in the Kenyan context. So the next one now, this slide specifically, I've just put these 6 topics because they are at the very least what needs to be considered when you talk about accountability within the space of sports. So for governance to be properly maintained, we need to ensure that there are policies on safeguarding and codes of conduct, because persons who are running these bodies need to have a code of conduct that explains how their affairs should be run day to day. They need to have anti-doping regulations because integrity within sport is a major principle. So we need to have regulations on that: match fixing, cheating in sports, anti-doping, etc. Rules of the game. FIFA has rules of the game because as football we need to understand, and they keep revising them over and over because the game keeps evolving over time. Eligibility criteria: who is supposed to go for trials, and how do you select a team? Competition rules, like we have the recent CHAN. You will discover that CHAN, definitely they have the competition rules for that. Disciplinary processes, like I said, they need to have legal regulation systems that are proper and running. Roles and responsibilities of officials for everyone to understand their duties. And then finally, autonomy. So when I talk about autonomy, interference versus intervention, I'm talking about ways in which sport bodies can maintain their autonomy outside influences like government and other organizations that are not within sports are likely to interfere with the autonomy of sport. And if it's not maintained, then governance will be spoiled generally. Then I think we go to the next slide, which I talk about principles of good governance. I have narrowed down to 9, but there are many, and these are the main ones anyway. For good governance, at the very lowest of cadres, the basic principles are transparency and accountability. You need to run organizations, but bodies, national federations, international bodies need to run in a transparent and accountable manner. They need to uphold equity, equality, and fairness. They need to have inclusivity within their processes. They also need to ensure all the members have access to information such that no information is bypassed and everyone is able to receive what they need to receive for their knowledge. Non-discrimination, definitely, because as I said, it's a very timely conversation and we have very many forms of discrimination within sports. And then finally, responsiveness, because there's no need of having a sport body that is not responsive to the needs of its members. And the last topic that I will cover, this is, as I said, I'm mainly just giving us an introduction, and then over time we will get into the nitty-gritties. The challenges of sports governance. Obviously, the first one is government interference. Many times you find that the government, politics, whatnot, interfere with sports, and they are very, very two different exclusive bodies with different roles altogether. And government sometimes interferes for their own interests. And that's why I talked about autonomy earlier, because autonomy, once it's maintained, then a governing body is able to have that autonomy to operate without any influence from outside. Corruption, obviously, we all know corruption is a major challenge facing sports governance. We have persons within the sports bodies whose main mandate is to ensure that all the monies get to their pocket and whatnot. Ego wars, we have persons within sports bodies who cannot listen to one another, which affects the overall governance of an organization and the governance of the sport. Interference with national law, sometimes you find that sports, for instance, has very particular laws that go all the way to the international level, and we don't touch our national laws sometimes. And so where there's no balance between the national law and the international governing law, you find that issues of governance are thereafter affected. Conflict of interest is an obvious challenge, because you find that persons, and that's why I said earlier that for a proper running organization, there needs to be roles and responsibilities of every person, eligibility criteria and whatnot, so that you avoid issues of conflict. And then lastly, we have human rights, non-discrimination, gender bias, abuse, safeguarding issues, and human trafficking, to say the least. These are some of the things that generally affect the running of sport. I think that marks the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, Hiram, and I look forward to more discussion.
Thank you, Caroline, for that very brief but comprehensive introduction. So we're now going to move to Mr. Anthony Tata, sorry. And as for Anthony, before you start speaking, and this is just to bring into perspective of what you're going to cover. So mega events inspire but can also expose deep governance and human rights gaps. So kindly share with us what you've learned from the recent CHAN tournament and what that means for AFCON 2027. So maybe just as you introduce yourself, I'll put up your slides and start projecting in the next few minutes.
So I've been having issues with my. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, I think you've done very much of the introductions, and because we don't have time, I think I should just go straight to my presentation.
Okay. Yes, please go
Right,
ahead.
so very well. Can I continue? Okay. My presentation is on human rights and mega sport movement. You know, and my area of my area was specifically on labor rights, community inclusion, non-inclusion, and a little bit of comment on okay. So can you please move slide? Okay, so but basically, human rights issues in sport are not very new, and the good news is that for some time, quite recently, like about 10 years, been from serious work making ensuring that human rights sport alive at some point reach fair play. But some of the generally
Sorry,
speaking,
you're a bit faint, so I'm not sure if it's the device you're using.
okay, let me. I don't know if you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. Okay. Can you hear me now?
So you can unmute to one device. There's a playback. So just unmute the one that you're using to speak to avoid the echo.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically, the general human rights issues are, mental and physical health, mental and physical welfare, athletes activism, labor rights, child protection, gender equality, LGBT, which is still a big issue in Africa, racism, access to sports, justice mechanism, fair play. So it's important we understand the general issues around human rights in sports, because that will also help us in understanding the subsequent slides. So the second one, the third page deals on the challenges that are specific to Africa. Now, of course, like my co-speaker Sarah has already pointed out, corruption and government interference are really big problems in sports and human rights in Africa. And it appears that the whole problems on human rights are centered around corruption and government. Now, I had written something on governance failure, but when I saw that Sarah was going to deal with it, I didn't bother to elaborate on it. So I will look at financial management. There has been a lot of scandals around financial management in sports in Africa, diversion of infrastructure sports and funds meant for infrastructure, then diversion of funds meant for athletes. Now, the question at this point will be, how does that impact human rights? Of course, that impacts human rights a great deal. Now, for example, when funds for sports infrastructure are diverted into private pockets or other purposes, what's the outcome of that? The outcome of that is that we have inferior sports infrastructure, which will endanger the lives of not just the athletes or players, but that of the spectators, the people who consume these sports, and other stakeholders around. So that is how that endangers their life, even their right to life, and their right to access to sporting events. Now, you're talking about diversion of athlete funds. Of course, that will I will do that more. I will speak on that more elaborately when I'm talking about the labor rights proper. But then, when it comes to government interference, we have local laws that interfere with people's rights. Now, currently in Africa, it's still a debate in the larger part of Africa whether LGBT rights should be considered rights in the first place. And a lot of African countries are opposed to that. So in sports today, especially in sport tournaments in Africa, those issues continue to come up. LGBT rights continue to come up and interfere with rights of athletes and rights of organizers in sports. Then freedom of expression is another huge challenge. Because in Africa, sports is largely funded by government. So there's this tendency for repressive governments to control the way athletes act, the way they talk, what they say, and what they shouldn't say. So those are big challenges that restrict the rights of some of these athletes. Then, sponsorship exclusion. If you compare the sponsorship that comes into Africa, to the sponsorship that go to other continents like Europe and America, you will see that Africa does not have a fair share of sponsorship coming into to sponsor sports, and this has created some form of exclusion, in sports participation, especially people who are less privileged and people who are perhaps doing amateur sports that the little sponsorship cannot take serious enough to get involved. So it also creates some form of exclusion from sports, and that exclusion is also is not actually consistent with human rights values. The next one, please.
Now we're looking at mega events proper. Now, of course, I do not need to belabor the fact that mega sporting events come with a lot of values to all stakeholders, the host communities. It can actually disrupt transport system. It can actually create some form of rapid development in places where they are being hosted. It can create some form of, it can impact on the economy positively. But even with that, mega events also come with its own challenges bordering on human rights. You know, the planning of mega events in sports, from bidding, award, preparation, and actual events, involve complex human rights considerations. In mega events, the consideration of human rights are beyond the athletes. So, you know, mega sport, you can't discuss mega events fairly just around athletes. There are other stakeholders when you are discussing mega events, and all those, they are all impacted by these mega events. And it would be fair to discuss how these stakeholders are impacted. Now, these considerations extend to workers, people who help in setting up these facilities, who build these facilities, volunteers who work around these facilities, host communities, and every other, even the organizers who are involved in the value chain of delivering these mega sports events. Now let's just speak a little. You know, my presentation borders largely on labor exploitation. Let's look at the labor exploitation in mega events can come in two ways. Now, the first one, the labor exploitation can come when you exploit workers. Now, these are the issues that arise when it comes to exploitation of workers. Could be child labor, which Sarah had already made reference to. Now okay, that's fine. Then you talk about unfair wages and long hours. So those are the labor expectations that can come from non-athletes or players involved in mega events. That will be elaborated more very soon. Now let's look at the expectation on the part of athletes. Now this there has been a lot of arguments as to whether athletes who play in mega events are employees or maybe they are contractors. Now, of course, that argument is fair, no matter how you look at it. But the peculiarity of Africa, and perhaps a good number of other continents, is that most of these mega events, especially AFCON, especially the ongoing CHAN and similar events like the FIFA World Cup and the Olympics, what happens is that people are pulled out of their different clubs where they already have contracts with their employer to come and play in those events. And after playing in those events, they go back. Now, by the time they leave those events to come and play in some of these events, there are some rights that come up. Of course, there have been one or two decisions saying that they may not exactly be employees in respect of these mega events because those events are quite seasonal, right? But however, it does not preclude them to having some rights, some contractual rights, than some rights, you know, arising from that event proper. And those rights could be the right to have wages for that, the right to be remunerated by their countries, the right to be provided with facilities. Of course, in Africa, our reality is this, that whenever we are attending this mega event, we pull out some of our athletes who live in Europe and America, who are exposed to those facilities, and bring them to come and contest for us, ignoring those at home. Of course, the reason is it's also easy to understand, because for us to have a competitive outing, we have to get athletes who are used to some of the facilities that are going to be used. So how do we protect these people while they are there, while they are working for the countries? There are human rights issues that arise: right to wages, right to be taken care of, right to be paid. I will still talk more on that when the conversation begins proper. Then we'll talk about forced displacement and all that. You know, forced displacement, discrimination, and poor infrastructure and planning. Now, poor infrastructure and planning, that's the place I want to bring in what is going on today in Kenya. You know, the CHAN event that is being hosted by Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, what's the name of the stadium? Is it Kasarani Stadium or something? You know, there was this stampede. There was poor organization of the ticketing. Things like that also bring up human rights issues, right to life. And from the information we had, there was also incidents of police using tear gas and firing shots. Those kind of things endanger the lives of players, athletes, and even the spectators. So we'll still talk about that. Next slide, please. So lessons from CHAN 2024. Security lapses at Kasarani Stadium. Now, I've mentioned this, the use of tear gas because of what happened in the stampede that happened, and having a lot of people trying to get into the stadium without even paying, using flash grenade by police, live ammunition, and stone throwing. All those constitute human rights threats to those involved in sports. Of course, we know why some of these things come up, and that takes us back to the corruption that we've also mentioned before. In Africa, a lot of corrupt practices can lead to very, very dangerous outcomes like this. When we compromise quality, when we compromise due process and things, we come out with very dangerous outcomes that put people's lives at stake. And some of these, the use of tear gas, flash grenade, live ammunitions, and stone throwing don't only affect the athletes, even the host communities where the sports infrastructure is located, they are all affected. So these are lessons we can take from CHAN 2024. Then the next one. So now, like I said when I started this presentation, this conversation has lasted for some time, the conversation on human rights and sports. And I am glad to let you know that there has been a lot of efforts into all these human rights issues concerning sports in the world and also in Africa. Now, what are the efforts? FIFA and the International Olympic Committee have taken steps to integrate human rights discussions in hosting. When they are discussing hosting with potential countries who are bidding to host mega events, of course, human rights consultations are taken seriously. So I think, and they have also integrated human rights units within their structure. Yes, the progress might be a little bit slow, but I think it's good news that we've started at all. Now, we also have an organization like the African Union Sports Council, who are already taking steps to ensure that human rights are protected in sports. We have the Center for Sports and Human Rights. It's a global, I'll call it a global NGO that monitors this and comes out with policies on how these things can be done. And they are doing wonderful work in the capacity they have to do what they need to do. The UN guiding principle on business and human rights are also working hard, coming out with a lot of advice, playing an advisory role and coming out with policies that can help human rights, especially in sports. Now, there's also a very interesting thing that happened in South Africa. That is the South African Human Rights Commission. They had a partnership with the South African Football Association, to create some form of a remedy situation. Because one of the biggest problems, like I mentioned, is the freedom of expression, and also having a good mechanism where victims of human rights in sports can ventilate and find justice. And I think that's a very bold step South African Football and South African Human Rights Commission did there. And as part of my recommendations when the time comes is to also to make sure that such a thing goes round, but at the same time, it has to also be independent of government. We will get there. Let's get into the next slide. Now, the next slide has to do with recommendations, because as we are discussing recommendations, of course, some of these organizations make recommendations, but there are some recommendations that are very, peculiar to Africa. Now, some of the recommendations we have made is that We have to standardize the remedy system, just like what South Africa did. We have to have a remedy system whereby the government will have no interference or no control, or little if they must have control, so that players will not be victimized, or victims of human rights will not be victimized. Yeah. Okay. Then you talk about labor rights, power to inquire into the welfare. What we are saying is that sports organizers should also be given oversight functions where they can be able to question the welfare packages of all those people participating. Because there are situations, especially African countries, when they go for events, there are situations of not paying the players, not taking care of them. Those things don't create a fair platform for them to compete. Then you're talking about infrastructure, monitoring of infrastructure to ensure that we don't use child labor, we don't abuse it. The next slide, please. Okay, I think that that's the part of. So by the time we begin the conversation, I'll be able to answer some of the questions that may arise from my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony. And unfortunately, we're kindly, or rather, running over time. Or I mean, we've taken too long with the presentation. But on to you,
I'm sorry
Tim.
about that.
As no worries. I mean, the reason why I'm holding off to cut you off is also because every information is relevant. So we're happy to hear more as we move along. With Timothy, and you're going to talk about gender discrimination. So maybe just to highlight in your presentation, and just to bring forth that gender discrimination in sport is both cultural and institutional challenge. Let's unpack how we can advance equity meaningfully. So maybe as you introduce yourself, I'll put your slides up in the meantime. Mr. Anthony, if you're able to mute on your mute, I appreciate that.
All right. Karen, can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, perfectly.
All right. Thank you. Just hold on a second or two for you to help me broadcast that presentation.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks. At least I can see your screen, hoping that even the rest of our audience can also do the same. So we'll be dealing with tackling gender discrimination and advancing equity in African sport. Next slide, please. And in here, we'll be, of course, looking at the key definitions that we need to know, especially in the sports context. That will be discrimination and gender, the main issues that currently are surfacing in this regard. And then we'll see how we've made a case for gender parity and the solutions that we may have. And we'll conclude by shining a bright light on those who are trying to make gender parity something that is actual on the continent of Africa. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yes, it is very, very important before we dive into to appreciate what really it is, especially in the sports context. So we can define gender for sports purposes as to be socially constructed roles or relationship between men and women. And of course, this includes the conceptions and misconceptions about masculinity and being feminine. And of course, it's not really only narrowing it down to men and women, but rather the inequalities that may be between the males and females. And as we go that far, we must not cross the line of again confusing it with feminism or women's studies. So we must strike a very, very, very small balance or very tender balance to get it right. And what could help us to get it right is really just acknowledging where the females or the female gender has been, you could say, disadvantaged or put in a disadvantaged positions in our societies. And this because the studies are often indicating that when you look at what benefits or what the playing field for males and females is really not balanced. But our aim is not only to say that once and again, but to craft the interventions on how we can correct the said imbalances. And in correcting that, we also bring in the second term, which is discrimination, which is at least simple. It doesn't have many red lines, which is, and simply say that we are giving unequal treatment to different categories of persons on unjustifiable grounds. And of course, a justifiable ground is very, very key because it's very key because in sport, there happens to be something that we called a level of acceptable or permissible discriminations in sport. As you may already be aware, in sport, there is gender discrimination. That's why you see females tournaments and male tournament. We are currently seeing the chant, but you're not seeing any women on the playing field because sport permits that. Although some disciplines like tennis have these mixed sets where you could see a male playing alongside a female, and even in some sport discipline like motorsport, they don't really care. Any male or any female can compete at whatever level, but largely if you go in other disciplines, basketball, netball, football, if you take many of these other disciplines, rugby, you see that there's gender discrimination. Another thing is discrimination on the grounds of age. Like you may realize, of course, at the top level, if you're seeing elite sport as well, like in football, we may not have much concern of when we see young stars like Yamin Lamar coming over and play with the other adults. But generally, that are the outliers. Generally, there are 8 categories, and you could see that you could see tournament that then say the tournament is under 17, the tournament is under 21, the tournament is under 15. So on to that level, there is just discrimination in terms of age, and this is really to create opportunity. And if you see in few disciplines like in swimming, there is then a category for the adults that really probably are 60 years plus, that they may at times they may give them a softer world of the legends. So there's a bit of discriminations on the ground of age. Then disability. In sport, there is also permissible discrimination on grounds of disability. And this example I can give us is if you're watching the Olympic Games, after the main event has ended, then there are the Paralympic Games, which are the games where these persons with disabilities are also allowed to play. Even in football itself, there's what they call amputee sport. It is now, those who are following the war in Ukraine, consider that because of the many amputees coming out in that part of Europe, amputee sport is growing. But you can see that in that extent, they are permitting discrimination on the ground of disability, and they call it permissible. The other one is in nationality. This is where we see it at when our countries are playing. Let's say currently, if Burundi hasn't qualified for the CHAN tournament, although East Africa is hosting, you cannot see that someone from Burundi is hosting. Even if you love Africa so much, if you're already an adult who has played at a senior level, let's say for the Republic of Tanzania, you cannot play in the Euros, or you cannot play in Copa America. So to that extent, they permit that level of discrimination. Then also finances. This is a hidden discrimination. They don't say it outrightly, but they put it in the requirements for you to qualify for something. I'll give us an example since we're in East Africa. To host the AFCON, to win the AFCON hosting rights 2027, these 3 countries had to jointly pay a guarantee of up to 90 million US dollars. Not even they're using, so you can see it's an African thing, we're East Africa, but we're paying 90 million US dollars as a guarantee to get the hosting rights for the AFCON 2027, which is also has pre-birthed this CHAN tournament that we're seeing. Now, if you juxtapose it with other poorer countries like in Burundi, that is about 1.5% of the last budget of that country. So if you're a poor person, you cannot engage in sport. Just want to use that example of the AFCON. And then what are the issues that really bring out this reality of a bit of discrimination in sport, justified or unjustified? Of course, what we can see is the limited funding. People always cry that, of course, the teams or the sports bodies are not injecting in as much in women's sport as they're investing in men's sport. Data shows that on average, the most earning women's team or the most funded women's team are getting about 5% of what would spend on the male sport. So if you find a team like Chelsea that has Chelsea men and Chelsea women, you see that the Chelsea men are having a big chunk of the funding, while the women are having a limited part of the funding, even though in some circumstances, the women's team are putting on better performances than the male's team. You can look at the clubs like we have at Arsenal. You look at the male's team may be trophyless, while you may find that the females team are the European champions, but the funding will go to the men's team. And of course, the few women in leadership position. The African Union statistics show that we have about 12%, only 12% of women in leadership position. That's generally. And of course, if we were to find any data on those positions being unique to football, then the numbers would be much worse. But if even at the highest level, at the general level, is 12%, then you can only imagine how low it can get if it is at sport. Sexual harassment, we've had this cries, and this is not only even gender neutral, it cuts across males and females in the training camps, in the teams, in the sports administrators, the coaches, core players, all these people are being victims and also aggressors in as far as sexual harassment is concerned. Then objectification in sports media. If you look at the photos that come out of events that are being undertaken by women, let's say in swimming, in tennis, there is a silent principle there that in order to attract more eyes to the women's game, they are forcing women to at times dress in uncomfortable manner, and they'll put cameras closer to positions that you wouldn't see them focusing on. If you're very, very careful, and let's say you're watching women's football, if a woman's going to take probably a corner kick or a throw in, you will see that the camera will be very, very close to her body. And if it's, let's say it's a male sport, then you see that they'll get you a camera angle that is giving you a larger view and not focusing only on the player. And that is not by accident. Many of these things are deliberate. Can watch many of these things of how the likes of wrestling and the early days of wrestling, how wrestling was coming out. You see that even women were, because wrestling is scripted, and they were being told to put off their bras for a second or two, and the cameras will take that, and yet the men wouldn't be told to take off their pants. So there is that bit of objection that is a silent killer in the men's games. Of course, training compensation. One of the reasons why there is heavier investment in male sport, especially in football, that football directly allows training compensation. If you train a male athlete and that person is taken by another club, you are entitled to training compensation. Yet, if the same happens for the women's game, the women don't get the training compensation. So they pull out the zeal of investment in investment in women's sport. And then there is the stereotypes and societal limitation. One of the things that I'll pick out for time is the strength. Some people say that women are weaker and then the men are stronger. But if you look at the Premier League, the most watched league in the world, the strongest shot last season was by Alexander Isak. But it was weaker than the shot that was taken by Chloe Kelly in the just ended Euro finals. So it's not a given that women are weaker than men. We've seen women do stronger things than what men can do. So we'll go to the next slide, please. All right, so we've already spoken about the levels of investment and how they come about. Then the other thing that is new here is the limited consumption in sports broadcasts. You can see that even not many of us are willing to watch the women's game as much as we want to watch the men's game. So because most of the cash cow for sport is really the broadcasting rights, if we don't watch more of the women's game, they'll attract fewer value in broadcasting rights, then leading to fewer investment in the women's game. Similar to that is the consumption of sports merchandise. You see many of us are buying these jerseys. It's CHAN season, and East Africa, we're putting on our national jerseys. But even those jerseys, they're jerseys that are meant for women, but women or the girls don't know this. So if someone is buying a jersey, you say, buy me a jersey. Whether someone is male or female, they'll just buy you a male jersey. Yet there are jerseys that are made for the women. But because we don't know that this merchandise does exist, we don't buy more of that, and then we discourage investment in women's sport thus far. Another thing that is really coming out now, these are the key emerging issues, and really the legal hurdles that we must be alert to as lawyers. And the key one is really sex testing and testosterone levels. We've all heard of the cases of Caster Semenya that was just concluded that by the European Court of Human Rights, pointing the fact that women, because when you see men that are performing very well because of the natural build of their bodies, there's no limitation. While if you're performing quite well because of your body naturally, then they'll say, you might be a woman, but inside or scientifically you're male. And then they are being forced into taking this test to confirm whether scientifically they are female, even if biologically they are female. And this has forced many greats off the tracks and playing fields because they're not comfortable with taking these substances to reduce their testosterone levels or to conform to whatever qualification a discipline might take as women, as feminine. Yet, if you juxtapose it with other things, let's say the LGBT question of saying that, now these people are saying they were biologically born male and then they are turning female, and then we want to advance their rights for them to play on the same field. Yet those who are born as female are being taken off the field because they are saying they are too female, they are too male to be called female. Next slide, please. Yes, and then the big one, the equal pay for equal work. That is the global standard on payment. But if we come to the reality, women are being paid much less than their male counterparts. If you see on average, where we can get data in Europe, you can see that the payment levels of the best that women's team can get to is a shy of 9% of what the men will be paid. And if you look at probably the best performing countries, including Spain, see that probably on average, men will be getting 200,000 euros, and then the women will be getting at most 16,000 euros, which is, if you're a woman, you'll be happy to hear about that. But many women are being paid much less, yet they're doing similar things. And we've seen the US team or the Olympic teams trying to call this out. And there's deliberate movements from the Western world to see that there can be equal pay for equal work for both males and females. But in Africa, we are yet to get an example of that. We're looking at progressive countries like South Africa to take the lead, but we are yet to find anyone who's strong enough to say it out loud that there needs to be equal pay for equal work in sport. Yes, then what is working? What is working? Because you have seen there are issues for and against the question of gender parity in sport. One of the solutions that is being tested is double match days. And even what this means that because there is low consumption of women's sport, they're saying, let the men's game and the women's game be played on the same day. This has also, even if you've seen it in Chan, in Uganda especially, they are playing the games of Uganda and other teams on the same day. And the result of that, Uganda has had, per seat available, has had the most attended games. Both the first game where Uganda is not involved and the second game where Uganda is involved. Because of the double match days, we are seeing more presence and match awareness in these games. So we are proposing that even when, especially because these teams have a male and females team, that they have a males team also have a females team so that people can get more engagement and traction from female sport. Then the prize money, there's a movement that if people should be paid the same money. If someone wins the Euros or wins AFCON, we'll just call it the WAFCON, the Women's African Cup of Nations. If Morocco are the champions and they take a certain amount X, and then Nigeria, the female champion, and they should take the same amount. Not saying that the winner of the males tournament will take probably up to $10 million, and then the winner for the men's discipline will take $500,000. That disparity also discourages gender parity. Of course, I've already spoken about solidarity and training. Just back a little. When we're talking about solidarity and training, we need to make sure that if there is training compensation for women, there should also be training compensation for, if there's training compensation for males teams or male athletes, the same should also apply for the women. And then safeguarding. Safeguarding, we're going to see it deeper, but the point here is that we tend to limit it to only children, but it also captures vulnerable adults. So if you're vulnerable adult, even if you're male or female, you should also benefit from the values and the principles of safeguarding. Then there is also forced licensing. So there is a movement that is even AFCON is CAF is adopting, even here in Uganda is being adopted. Same thing for Kenya and Tanzania. Is that before they license a men's team, the men's team is being forced to have a females team, so that this you cannot, let's say, if you cannot be a big club in the country, a males team sport, but you're not supporting any females team. So before your license, teams are being forced to get male counterparts before they can get a license. Then, of course, the last one is really the associations. They are creating special associations for women's sport. And we can look at AWIS that is already on the continent. And there is a movement that, as we see the likes of FIFA Pro that are gender neutral, there should be those that are specific for women's sport. And the last one is the gender parity games, ensuring that the people who go in the games, the numbers of people numerically are the same on both genders. And the first people to achieve, or the first tournament to achieve this, was the just concluded Paris Olympic Games, where we had 50% female participants and 50% male participants. The last slide, Karen. Yes, that should have been the last slide, and we're happy to take questions after the panel discussions.
Yes, thank you, Timothy. And as we move on to our last presenter for this session, and Sarah, should I invite you to speak next? So safeguarding is a term we hear often, has been mentioned previously with, I think, two, if not all of our presenters so far, but legal enforcement remains patchy. So walk us through what robust legal protection for athletes really looks like.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Chwada. I am a pioneering practitioner at the frontier of sports, entertainment, and fashion law, with a practice spanning over 13 years in sports legislation, arbitration, lecturing, and litigation. I currently serve as the vice chair of the FIFA Football Tribunal Player Status Chamber, and I'm involved in shaping national and sports policies in safeguarding. So I can see some of our attendees are non-lawyers. For example, Ms. Quinta Odongo, who does some incredible work in sports management in Kenya. Karibu sana. And I'll be presenting a little bit differently than my fellow panelists. I don't have any slides, but I would like for you to listen actively without relying so much on what's on your screen. Okay? So today I would like us to focus on how together, whether you're a legal practitioner or not, we can create frameworks that protect the dignity of the most vulnerable classes of people working within sports. And I want to begin by sharing a secret and end by giving you a challenge. So what's my secret? Well, the secret isn't mine per se. It's a secret within the realm of sports that people rarely report to institutions, but they report to people they trust. So within my own experience, complaints have been brought to me by family members, a friend, a colleague who is connected to a victim of a breach of trust. And majority of these complaints I've received are raised by journalists, and not the kind of journalists who do investigative work or investigative journalism, but the journalists who are trained to work on the field every day, creating reports for the daily news or recording scores for their sports desks. And why do people trust field journalists more than they trust officers within their own sports institutions? It's because of a system of fear and silence. Sports officials are perceived as being too valuable to be reported, or rather they are more valuable than the sports person or the official who's working within the ecosystem. So sports people, athletes seek solace or sympathy from someone who is an insider without really being so much of an insider, but who is an outsider enough of their ecosystem where they can be trusted with the information and not suffer from retaliation. So where do we go from here? We can start with understanding the sporting ecosystem. And the sports ecosystem has two kinds of personalities or two kinds of people. You have regulators and you have operators, as my colleagues have mentioned. And very often when we're dealing with regulators and operators, we have a network of power imbalance, because both the regulators and the operators want to control two things. They want to control access and they want to control resources. So let's start from identifying who are these regulators, who are the operators, and then we'll dive into how these two groups act in relation to access and resources within sport, and then how access and resources also leads to safeguarding mechanisms. Okay? I hope I'm not going too quickly. If I am, just give me a heads up, Kyron. So regulators are the ones who build the sports systems that we all know and enjoy. They determine how people function within these sports systems. So a good example is international sports federations such as FIFA and their member associations such as FKF or FUFA from Uganda, right? Or you could have a regulator who is a multi-sports organization such as the International Olympic Committee and its affiliates, which are the National Olympic Committees of every nation in the world. Or you could have a regulator who's in charge of certain disciplinary mechanisms, such as anti-doping. So you have an anti-doping body such as the World Anti-Doping Agency, or WADA, and its national anti-doping organizations worldwide. So those are the regulators within the ecosystem. And then the operators are the ones who act at various levels, who ensure that this machinery of sports keeps running, okay? So you have sports administrators or executives, you have athlete support personnel such as coaches, trainers, scouts, agents, and finally, at the bottom of that pyramid, you have athletes themselves. So how do these regulators and operators behave in relation to access and resources? Access is a dual capacity highway. You're either controlling access to opportunities or you are controlling access to an asset. So the greatest opportunity for an athlete in sports is participation in competition. Athletes are seeking this golden ticket. Access to competitions will help them earn a living. And many times the person between an athlete and that golden ticket is either an administrator or an athlete support personnel. On the flip side, the greatest asset for a regulator is an athlete. Without talented athletes, there will be no competition. So regulators leverage access to competitions in order to unlock money from sponsors. But the people controlling access to the talent are administrators and athlete support personnel. So this ecosystem is fertile ground for abuse and exploitation. So I'm going to tell you about some of the abuses in the sporting ecosystem. I will name them and briefly explain what they are. And then towards the end or towards the panel discussion, I can give you actual examples of some of the situations that I've personally dealt with, which deal with these kind of exploitative systems. Okay, so the first kind of abuse within the sporting ecosystem is administrative abuses of power. And these happen mostly during player registration or team selection, okay, because you're controlling access to competition. So what you'll have during player registration or team selection is age manipulation. Either you'll be signed up as older or younger than you are, or you'll have retaliation for insubordination. Suppose you reported someone or an official for doing something wrong, they will retaliate by saying, I will not put you on this team. Or, as one of my colleagues has mentioned, Timothy, there is compulsory gender testing. And this is an administrative abuse of power if you take people out of training or if you take them out of their schooling system and you tell them, we must force you to take this gender testing, otherwise you will not participate in sports. And another abuse of power is sports trafficking. You move individuals from one location to another for purposes of involving them in some sort of competition. You do it either through coercion or force. And the difference between coercion and force is that coercion can be done through threats or false promises. And a lot of times people fall for false promises. You'll get a lot of money, we'll take care of your parents, we'll buy you land, we'll put you through schooling and such. So that's the first kind of abuse within the sporting ecosystem, administrative abuse of power. The second form of abuse is fiduciary abuse. Okay? A fiduciary is someone who is put in a position of duty to help you. For example, your agent or your manager or your lawyer. But sometimes a fiduciary abuse comes about when you have self-dealing tactics, where the agent, the manager, or the lawyer puts themselves in a position to benefit at the expense of the athlete who you owe a fiduciary duty to. So some of the fiduciary abuses within the sports ecosystem include illegal contracting of minors, whereabouts failures, and let me explain a little bit where illegal contracting of minors and whereabouts failures come into play. So you could be an agent or a manager or a lawyer, and in order for you to contract a minor, you need to have the consent of the parents. But the way you go about getting that consent of the parent or the legal guardian is what is coming into question, because a lot of these parents sign over control of their minors so that these minors are contracted to professional or semi-professional competitions. And a lot of times they rarely see any fruits of the labor of the minors. And where does whereabouts failures come in? A lot of our athletes, especially those who come from rural areas, are either literate or semi-literate. So they leave the filing of their anti-doping whereabouts to their agents or managers. And sometimes whenever there's a disagreement or a contractual issue, these agents and managers will say, we're going to mess up your whereabout filings so that you will get suspended for 2 years and you will no longer be able to participate in sports unless you stick to us and extend your contract. So that's some of the fiduciary abuses that go on in sports. The third kind of fiduciary abuse is unjust enrichment, and it's different from a fiduciary abuse. The third kind of abuse within sport is unjust enrichment, and it's different from fiduciary abuse in that fiduciary abuse, you have someone who is has a professional duty towards you. But unjust enrichment occurs when someone who does not necessarily have a professional duty towards you unfairly benefits at your expense without earning it or providing compensation for it. So this is particularly rife amongst guardians of minors, spouses of athletes, or even other family members like siblings who fraudulently obtain money from athletes who have just been paid, or they transfer properties to themselves, even though that property belongs to the athlete, who is their wife, their brother, or whatever the case may be. The fourth type of abuse I'll speak about, and it's kind of connected to the next two, or allow me to just list them: the sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, and sexual harassment. And there are three very distinctive types of abuses. So sexual abuse occurs when there's actual or threatened physical or psychological intrusion of a sexual nature. It can either be by force or by coercion. It has to be actual or threatened to your physical body or to your psychological mind of a sexual nature, either by force or by coercion. It's different from sexual exploitation, which is an actual or attempted abuse of a sexual nature by a person in authority or in a position of trust against a person who is in a position of vulnerability in exchange for access to opportunity. So, for example, you have a coach or a manager who says, we need you to do this sexual favor for us in order for you to gain access to competition or in order for you to gain access to the next team selection. A very now famous case of sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. There's been the cases with the US gymnastics team where Simone Biles and her teammates came together to report the sexual abuses that had been going on against them. and also the case which was heard and determined by the FIFA disciplinary about the ex-under-17 coach from Gabon. Then you have sexual harassment. And sexual harassment is basically any unwelcome sexual advances, gestures, or requests for a sexual favor that may cause offense or humiliation. If your idea is to simply goad at someone for the sake of humiliating them or causing them offense, that would be sexual harassment. And all these type of abuses are dealt with differently in sports. So let me just list them again. The kind of abuses within the sports ecosystem: administrative abuses of power, fiduciary abuses by lawyers, agents, and managers, unjust enrichment by guardians of minors and spouses of athletes, sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, and sexual harassment. So how do we create guardrails within safeguarding frameworks to ensure effective protection within sports? Because what safeguarding is essentially is trust building and intervention. And right now, the problem is a lot of our safeguarding tools provide frameworks which assume that the offense has to happen before we step in. So my challenge is, can we flip it so that we don't have a perfect system which takes care of an offense after it has happened, but have a livable framework which will help someone before the offense takes place? Or if someone feels like something is wrong or off, but doesn't have the vocabulary to explain that this is wrong and off, but I know something has to be done. So what do you do if you have that kind of feeling, or you need to seek help if you suspect something is off? Some of our frameworks need to have, or rather, our frameworks need to track three things. They need to be understandable, they need to be accessible, and finally, they have to be emotionally safe, because you're dealing with a human-to-human relationship. So what do I mean by this? A framework being understandable. It should be written or available either in plain language or in a medium that a vulnerable person understands. For example, if it's written, it has to be plain English or plain Kiswahili or plain whatever language you are speaking in your nation. But if you're a person with disability, it has to be available in a medium that you understand. A blind person might be able to access audio or might be able to access Braille. A deaf person will hopefully be able to read, but you can make it available in sign language if you're going to have someone who will digitize it or record it on a camera. But if you're literate or semi-literate, what kind of medium are we going to make this information available in? Do we just do it in form of a podcast, a short note, an audio? What do we do? So the rules have to be understandable to the vulnerable person who needs to benefit from it. The rules also have to be accessible, meaning they have to be visible and not hidden. So a lot of these forms that we have come up with, yes, but you find like the third page after the fifth click after answering a few questions, so you find the report form. It's not as easily available as, let's say, access to ticketing information for the next match of CHAN, right? So this is something that we need to work on. How can we make our interventions accessible? And lastly, our interventions or the policies have to be emotionally safe. They have to promote trust building, because silence is dangerous. But speaking up shouldn't feel like a personal risk, which is why I mentioned a lot of times athletes will more likely express themselves with a journalist who is around them day to day because they know them. And in many occasions, even those journalists see for themselves or witness the kind of atrocities that are going on day to day with these sports people. So they feel like perhaps these daily journalists are a safer space for me to explain myself rather than going through the system of safeguarding chaperones, officers, officials who have been given by the federations and who, by the way, some of are offenders, but who are still working within those federations. Now, everything I've told you should ideally work within the private law realm that sports operates in. But sports doesn't exist in a vacuum. It operates within the context of social contracts and nationhood. So beyond disciplinary measures, we should also explore public law mechanisms to bolster safeguarding efforts within sports. What do I mean by this? We need integration or complementarity between sports disciplinary systems and criminal prosecutions. For example, sexual offenses. Kenya has a very robust Sexual Offences Act, and it also recently digitized the Sexual Offenders Registry. But there's no link between the sports ecosystem and the criminal prosecution system and the judiciary system of Sexual Offenders Registry. The other thing we should do is have reporting of fraudulent acts to financial institutions such as banks and land registries to safeguard the finances of those within the sports ecosystem. We should also have a system of issuing protection orders as soon as possible, or within at least 3 hours of issuing a complaint. So what does a protection order do? It ensures that whoever has been suspected of offending a particular victim will not have access to them for a period of time until or unless investigations have been done. So that means within the legal system, you are not allowed to approach this person for however long. And then that will follow up with or be complemented with whatever disciplinary processes that the offender will have to go through within sports. And then lastly, we should have better information sharing networks between the operators. For example, if you have an offender who is working within athletics and then athletics bans them from athletics for life, that does not stop that offender from joining volleyball and doing the very same thing. So information sharing networks between the different disciplines are important, but also information sharing between law enforcement authorities as well. So let me leave you with that for now. Just let you know that safeguarding is no longer a luxury and it shouldn't be a privilege. It should be a professional standard and a human right. So I'll be open to questions and explaining anything else that you might have, in case you're curious about the subject matter. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for all our speakers today for those very comprehensive and I believe very important aspect that you've been able to highlight for this webinar. So maybe because we already have only 40 minutes left to our webinar, and I'll go back to our speakers now and just do more specific questions to them one by one. So I have a twofold question, and I'll hope you can at least take maybe less than 5 minutes in answering this. And I'll start with you, Caroline, again, on your subject on governance in sports. So you've generally highlighted how many sports bodies, or rather there's a lacking of strong governance policies, and most of them being on paper, but implementation enforcement still remains weak. What can you say would be the accountability mechanism that we need to work in our context, and how can governance framework move from reactive after crisis to proactive prevention?
Okay, so thank you for that question, Hiran. I will start by saying I agree with what Sarah had said towards the end of her presentation. You'd find that some of the offenders get back to office post their offenses, and so one of the ways in which strong governance policies can be implemented is, first of all, by removing persons who, quote unquote, become office bearers from holding office, especially where they're not qualified to do so. So you find that many of the organizations, sports organizations, especially in Kenya, we have very good policies, that govern the sport, but then nothing happens past the policy. So it's just there on paper, but there's no implementation going on. And the reason why that happens is because the office itself, the office bearers have no interest in implementing that. So I usually encourage the clients that come my way, for instance, who want to sue on issues of governance, I usually encourage them, first things first, have a re-election, remove those people, bring in the persons who are interested in implementing. So that, of course, will be my very beginning opinion. And then the other issue will be sometimes governance is affected because persons who are interested in making a change are prevented from doing that. So if we can bring up better whistleblower protection mechanisms, that will work. For instance, issues of sexual harassment and anything that touches on safeguarding basically needs a mechanism in which there is an anonymous reporting system and whistleblowers are protected from any form of harm or threat. So partnerships, I would encourage sports bodies to partner with organizations who have the same idea and the same roadmap that is implementing. So sports bodies sometimes are handicapped because they don't have persons who are well versed with a particular project which is aimed at implementing the goal. And so partnering with maybe even sports organizations outside the country will work. Partnering with sports organizations even within other neighboring countries, like for instance, FKF will partner with FUFA or NFF with Nigeria, just to ensure that the implementation process goes on. But to answer the second question on reactive to proactive, yes, one of the ways will be reviewing the policies. It's important for sports organizations to review their policies over and over. I mean, from time to time, just so that they're able to bring in better ideas. Amending those policies will help because some sports organizations operate policies as, I don't know, 2005. And so that needs to be reviewed, absolutely. And education and training, we can never run out of creating awareness through educating people, training those people. And lastly, I would say, this is even like a bonus point that covers both questions, involving the athletes themselves in the implementation process, because there's no need of running a sports organization on behalf of players, but the players are not involved in the communication, they're not involved in the processes. So they know their needs better than me, who sits as the administrator. And so if those few points I've brought out are well dealt with, then we'll able to have more proactive responses and we'll have better implementation mechanisms in place, especially for these policies. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Caroline. Maybe one other point would be to custom make and provide policies that are fully encompassing the different cultural and socioeconomic stance of different countries and regional realities, other than copy pasting policies that are done by the Western experts and bodies, and then expecting them to fully apply in a different contexts. Thank you again, Caroline, for that very elaborate answer. And I move on to Anthony again, and I would ask you again in terms of the tournaments that you briefly highlighted in your presentation. So from the recent CHAN tournaments to upcoming AFCON 2027, what recurring human rights risk have you observed in the African hosted mega events? And what lessons and good practices can you ensure, or rather can you maybe highlight that would ensure host communities benefit without harm? So again, a quick round in less than 5 minutes if possible. You're muted still.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So I think the answer should go like this. It's not just in respect of mega events held in Africa, because there are actually very few mega events actually take place in Africa. But we should look at it from the perspective of the involvement of Africans in mega events, which also covers now there has been a lot of reoccurring incidents in around mega events. Now, on the part of the players or athletes African athletes, there has been this this issue of remuneration by their countries. Some get to those events and they get stranded and they are not being paid and they will not be supported in any way while they are there. You know, those can create an unequal playing ground, which could affect their right to compete favorably. Because when they are not being taken care of, they are unable to concentrate on some of these activities, and of course, you see them starting from behind the line. Now, secondly, let me use the case the CHAN 2024 that is going on currently in Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. You know, it's not surprising, essentially, what happened between the match between Kenya and Morocco, where there was some form of stampede. The ticketing was poorly done. Now, what that shows is that we still have a very poor infrastructure level in Africa in terms of sports infrastructure. And this keeps coming up anytime. Perhaps South Africa is the only country that has, will I say, successfully, hosted a mega event without much ado. But whenever some of these things happen in a lot of countries in Africa, you see this kind of stampede happening. So, and they come from corruption. And by the time you begin to investigate what went wrong, you will understand that those who are in charge of administration of sports did not do what they're supposed to do. So these are some of the things we should begin to look into. Corruption has eaten up so deep, and there are consequences. And the consequences is the infringement of our rights in terms of right to life, access to sports, and every other thing around it. Now, in respect of the host community, I think the host community, that's a part we should also pay more attention to, because Africa, as it is, most times when we bid to host some mega events, we usually start from the scratch, or we begin to, because most of the facilities we have may not fit the purpose of what we are bidding for. So what we do most times is to go to the villages, evacuate people from their lands, begin to build facilities, and we just treat them carelessly. So those are the things I think sports bodies should also take into consideration. If you are bidding for a mega event, we should be able to know the land you are using. There should be some form of oversight from those bodies. The land you are going to use, the facility you are going to use, how are you going to obtain them? When that is resolved, we'll go to the next step. How are you going to build them? Are you going to align with labor laws to make sure you don't abuse the workers that are coming in? These are some of the things that the sports bodies and stakeholders should be asking to ensure that these things are properly done. But the recurring thing is the corruption that comes from not taking care of athletes. It happens all the time, and the proliferation of bodies. It's just that we don't have time, but I would have made reference to the Puma case that happened in Nigeria in 2021, which was quite embarrassing. Why the Athletes Federation of Nigeria signed a contract with Puma, the Nigerian Minister of Sports said they were not going to sign. They signed another contract with another local manufacturer, and the whole thing became a mess because of power tussle. But I'll leave it there until further questions come. I think I'm able to answer your question.
Anthony, and thank you for all of you for being very precise. So we're moving to Timothy, and then lastly, Sarah. So Timothy, you've covered in your presentation gender inequality, and you've shown how it often stems from cultural norms and institutional bias. So maybe just as you answer both your questions, how, or rather, which inequality do you think is harder to change, and why? And in that same breath, can you tell us what practical steps can federations or sports bodies generally take to ensure women athletes have equitable access to funding, facilities, and leadership?
All right, thank you, Karen. On the first one, whether it's the institutional or the cultural norms, I think they're equally as challenging, but probably what would help us is to look at the root causes. And probably for the institutional, it's really these our society or the culture is really these are our societal cultural biases, and these are within us, and they won't go away as easily. But probably the benefit or the positive to look at it is that Africa is the youngest continent. Close to 1 billion of us on the continent are youths or much younger than that. That means that because of this newer generation, it's more exposed and has fewer limitations. And we are counting on this generation that has been exposed, that has been educated, that has learned how things are best done and knows how things should be done on the continent. We hope that within time, these discrimination on grounds of societal cultural norms would be wiped out. The other on the institutional history leadership. If you look, sport has something unique in that the leaders of these sports bodies find a way of entrenching themselves in these positions. If you have a look at, let's say, let's take football, the most popular sport. You look at its leaders from the years of likes of Sepp Blatter and the like. These people are holding elections unopposed for years or even for decades. You look at what was happening in Africa, Issa Hayatou, until trouble came. And you look at Patrice Motsepe, unopposed. Same thing for Uganda. Kenya, you're lucky probably because it has been a turmoil that you had some elections there. Same thing for Tanzania. And it's not even when you go to Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, the leaders entrench themselves in these positions. Now, if the female voices are outside of the room in those entrenched positions, it becomes very challenging to change positions. But why it may be easier than the cultural norms that it doesn't take much to actually uproot this institutional leadership that is probably nail bent or not changing some certain things. Let's say if someone is of the view that someone who's born female has to take something to suppress her testosterone for her to qualify as female in that sport. It just takes a different leader with a different view who would be accommodative, who will know the background of the African woman on the continent, how they're built out, and how sport could be many times the only avenue that she could use to break through and have a good life. We are lucky that now we have the IOC president as being African. So you see that even though institution is difficult, it's easier to change in that if the stakeholders rise up, a new leader can come in place and all these institutional biases could be wiped out in just by merely changing leadership. New leaders could come with different structures that recognize the plight of the women and make a case for achieving gender parity across the board, on the field and off the field. On the second question as to what we could do, I think we laid out this in the presentations. But probably what we can add to that is the quota system. In that if you look at the IOC in Rwanda has been one of the big ones that we can look at. They have a quota system for how many women should be on their IOC executive committee, and it's 30%. But if you count the numbers now, they're 50%. As a result, in the Paris Games 2024, they had 62.5% of female athletes representing Rwanda. So you see how that change in leadership then in the quota system translated into actual meaningful change for the girl child in the country of 1,000 hills. The same could be if we adopt those quotas, not only to tick a box, because some people set up these quotas and these positions of women's vice president, head of women's football, but they don't have the intention of making that meaningful and giving them power. But if we take up these quotas and actually give these women power to change the game, then it could change for better. That is in addition to what we've already said about ensuring that there's fairer training compensation, equal pay for equal work, having match days, let's say for the women's game and men's game. If we can, if circumstances permit, there should be no barrier to us having the games played by the ladies and men on the same day at the same stadium so that we can have more activations and knowledge about the men's game. That's what I could share for now.
Thank you so much, Timothy. And lastly, but not least, over to you, Sarah. And as you highlighted safeguarding in your presentation, what legal tools can hold perpetrators and negligent institutions accountable? And maybe how can you also highlight how these safeguarding frameworks can be designed to protect all at-risk groups, not just children? And as we wrap up, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So over to you, Sarah.
So let me deal with how do you ensure that the institutions which are not up to standard with safeguarding become so. So one of the recommendations that I had made at a national level is that these institutions should be deregistered unless they have proper safeguarding mechanisms within their regulations and their policy frameworks. So what does deregistration do for a sports organization in Kenya? If you are deregistered, it means the government no longer recognizes you as a legal entity operating within the Kenyan borders, meaning whatever competitions you are planning, as much as they are going to be sanctioned by your international federation, your other affiliates, they probably will not enjoy the support of the government of the day because you do not live in a vacuum, as I had mentioned, and without proper registration, you will not be able to get security for your games or your competitions. You'll not even be able to be given funding for those specific teams which you're going to send on national trips or for national assignments. And you also will not get to fly the banner of Kenya because it's very important for the sitting president to hand over the symbol of national unity to any team which is going to be participating abroad, representing us as a country. So with deregistration as part of the penalty, we can actually go very far in ensuring that policies are recommended and implemented and enforced within sports organizations. That's one. So for individuals, how do you ensure that individuals are also within this framework and are competent and are also professional? Now, the problem within sports is that individuals can be eligible to operate within sports. For example, if you're a FIFA licensed agent, so long as you have the license, you can operate as an agent. You may be eligible, but not suitable. Okay, so suitability means, do you have integrity within yourself and within your character to ensure that money will not be mishandled, to ensure that you will not harass, intimidate, or threaten anyone within the footballing community or within the sports network? So what's missing, or the gap that I've seen within the safeguarding frameworks, is we focus so much on eligibility of individuals, whether they're going to become the president or whether they're going to become a coach or an agent, but we miss out on the characteristics of suitability of an individual. Now, one organization which has done very well in carrying out suitability tests, the WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. If you're going to become an anti-doping agent, or rather an anti-doping officer, you must have certain qualities rather than qualifications. And they actually list for you the kind of qualities that you must pass in order to become an anti-doping officer. If you miss those qualities, you will not be suitable as that. So we also need to come up with qualities rather than eligibility criteria. And then for institutions which are, for example, non-state actors like international federations, a lot more difficult. But what we can begin exploring is how do we begin penalizing the sponsors who work with institutions that are not implementing safeguarding or enforcing safeguarding mechanisms. So if you are, let's say, a title sponsor of a competition for an international federation, but the international federation is not implementing safeguarding policies, nations or even actors within the commercial realm can begin punishing or penalizing sponsors who work with such institutions. So that's my idea around those things. In terms of how do we ensure that all other vulnerable groups are taken care of within the safeguarding frameworks, it really ties down now to our work as legal practitioners. The description of who is going to be classified as a vulnerable group or a vulnerable person has to be within the policies themselves. So if your focus has been always on the minors, but you're excluding women. You're excluding people living with disability. You're also excluding those who are supporting those who are athletes within these spaces. Then you're not really safeguarding the entire ecosystem. You're acting on a knee-jerk reaction towards a very small group of people who will eventually grow up to be adult vulnerables. So we have to look at the entire chain of those who are protecting amongst the sports segment. So those are my questions which you've asked me. I don't know if now I can go into the Q&A, which
Yeah,
were asked.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for that. I mean, your tackle for that question, and I believe there's two that you've mentioned that you would like to highlight, and both of them I mean, are reflecting on the FIFA tribunal. So kindly proceed to answer them live, and then we can move on to the other. I believe one question and two comments. Yeah. Go ahead, Sarah.
Okay, so the first question is, in practice, how can the FIFA tribunal enforce equal treatment in contract stability, salary protection, and dispute resolution timelines for women footballers, especially in countries with entrenched gender disparities? So, the FIFA tribunal listens to all cases which are brought to it according to the procedural rules governing the regulations on status, RSCP, regulations on the statutes of status and transfer of players. Okay, so the RSCP covers professional players and amateur players. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you are covered under the RSTP. Now, enforcing equal treatment is not under the jurisdiction of the RSTP or the jurisdiction of the FIFA Football Tribunal. We adjudicate disputes concerning contracts, concerning registration, and concerning transfers. But enforcement of equal treatment will have to be done through the other mechanisms. For example, FIFA's disciplinary and ethics committee, which deals with those kind of issues concerning gender issues, harassment, intimidation, and all that. That's outside the realm of the FIFA Football Tribunal. But contractual stability, salary protection, if you have a dispute, a bona fide dispute, please read the procedural rules and go through the right channels. The FIFA has what's known as a transfer matching system, the FIFA TMS. That's where you can input a lot of your cases. And then even within that TMS system, you'll be able to follow the order of proceedings and where your case has reached, who's taking over it at which point, and whether or not it has been adjudicated, reported on, and if you have within time of appeals. So that's the first question. Next question. When a player wins a claim, but is quietly blacklisted in the market, does the FIFA tribunal see this as a human rights violation? And if so, why aren't there explicit sanctions to protect whistleblowers in football? So the FIFA tribunal, I'll take you back to, we have certain jurisdictions. Human rights is not one of them. We're limited in our operations or our operative strongholds, if I can put it that way. So if you have won a claim, that in itself should trigger the enforcement of, have you won a claim for payment? So how can you begin the process of receiving payment, whether it's from a club which owes you, or have you won a claim of getting an international transfer certificate? And in which case, what procedures can you take on in order to ensure that the ITC is released from one association to another so that you can transfer freely? Things like that. But we don't look at blacklisting as a human rights violation. In fact, what I will advise is get a really good agent, okay? Because agents, part of their relationships is to understand the market, and to have and foster relationships with the directors of competition or club directors, the scouts, and the team managers. If you have an agent who has really good relationships with these kind of officials, you should be able to navigate the blacklisting. However, for me personally, I feel like it's not enough. I think the TMS can be expanded into a marketplace so that even clubs in the lower divisions can be able to showcase, number one, we want a player, a midfielder, left foot, or whatever it is. This is the salary you want, and we're offering, and this is when we're going to do it. But what we don't have in football is a marketplace for people to actually see what's happening within the markets, whether it's in Africa or beyond Africa. And it's really frustrating for really new football agents in particular. There's a lot of gatekeeping. So I would love to see at some point FIFA expanding the role of TMS to include a marketplace for such kind of issues. I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So there's one from Juliet, and she's asking, and I would call upon Timothy to answer this. I have a couple of questions, and she's saying the issue of testosterone level in athletics and Caster Semenya case, is it really discrimination or is it aligning with fairness in competition? According to her, her view is that the latter is the case, and she hopes that would be have specific races for that category. I'm not sure if she's calling upon IOC to allocate a special race for DSD athletes, but Timothy, go ahead and answer that question.
All right. Thank you. Of course, we have to be accommodative of different opinions, and of course, the argument that is being that was put out in the Caster Semenya case is that, of course, it was in the view of saying that they're making sport more fairer. That is it. But if you remember our start, you started with us, we try to define discrimination because it's key to understand what it is. And simply put, it's just giving unequal treatment to different categories of people. And then the justification is the question. So the justification here is fairness. But if you look at the different categories of people, and this is gender, we've had the likes of Muhammad Ali who boxed for decades, and no one asked why they were boxing that strong. We've seen Usain Bolt, whose record is yet to be challenged, and no one has asked why he was that fast. We've seen the likes of Lionel Messi and Cristiano Ronaldo who have played for years at the highest level, and no one has asked. We've seen the likes of Zlatan who've gone. Luka Modric is almost clocking 40. These guys are still playing, but no one is asking why they are playing that strong for that long or why they are that good in their certain disciplines. The only question that came about, I think, was in regard to even Michael Phelps. If you remember, the guy was swimming in US, who was winning gold after gold. No one was asking why he was winning that strong. We remember Neil Armstrong. I should have been the Tour de France, who this guy was winning race after race, if I remember the name right. And
Lance Armstrong.
yes, Lance Armstrong. Roy was saying that, and then they only came out after he had partially that he was actually using prohibited substances. But because he was male, no one was asking whether he was too male to be male. So the question is, if we've let the Ronaldos and Messi's play over time, if we let Michael Phelps swim into retirement, why can't we let Caster do her thing until she's retired? That's the question. Why are we giving her different treatment? Why are we saying that even the males, we need to find out why these guys are doing so good? Because that was the question we're asking, how can this lady be this good? And they said, oh, this is good because of this. And if we are to determine what levels of testosterone would qualify one as a woman, and let's say we're looking at now testing on the solution of categories, wouldn't it be fair that we first create her category before we can push her out? Wouldn't it be fair? Because we're asking about discrimination. Why do we push her out and yet probably we know about her, and probably I think there were two other Kenyans, there were a few athletes running in different disciplines. Did we create a category for them? Or we just said we dictate that you must take suppressing substances to get to the levels of testosterone that we qualify as good. So if we just sit on, give the base of our argument being just a different treatment to different categories of people, if it is good that we determine how much biologically must someone be woman, then why don't we just be leveled across the board, say that even as we've said this, even for males, let us say that for you as a male, stop at this level. Then we could say, okay, now we're being fair. But if if it has been here for many years, and the males who are doing very well continue to do very well until they go into retirement, my view, I could be wrong. I don't see then why we should force a woman into early retirement just because she's biologically good. That would be my
Yeah, thank you, Timothy. And just to give it more context in terms of PhELP, and according to sports scientists and media, of course, PhELP was known to produce less lactate that most athletes during high intense exercise. And
exactly.
of course, he was able to also clear lactate faster, meaning his muscles remove more quickly between efforts. And of course, if you look at his large wingspan, also he had some sort of advantage over other athletes. So maybe just to put that into more context, so you can read more on it on your own time. I will intentionally move through questions to Sabelo because we literally only have 8 minutes. And if you have any more further questions once the webinar finished, please reach out to the speakers. I hope they're open to be contacted directly either on LinkedIn, or if they're happy to produce their email addresses, you can reach out to them for further context. But Sabelo is asking on the aspect of differentiating between qualities and qualifications when an individual applies, what mechanism is there to ensure that the information supplied is authentic? And I'll leave this open to anyone who would like to tackle that. I don't know if Sarah, Anthony, you'd like to handle that one?
Yeah, I'd like to handle it because I'm the one who raised it.
Mm.
A lot of times it's not about the information you give, it's about the kind of person you're presenting yourself to be. So it's more of a human resource aspect, right? Can you test this quality to this person? For example, is this person patient? That's a quality, correct? You can't test patience on paper. So you have to invent a situation or get information about this person being a patient individual. Is this person trustworthy? You can't tell that on paper. Is this person personable? Because if you're, for example, an anti-doping officer, you are likely going to deal with people who do not speak the same language as you, but you need to conduct yourself in a manner that people will understand. So are you the kind of person who is very service oriented, have a pleasant disposition? So those kind of qualities you test on paper, you have to test in person. And you have a rigorous system or a rigorous process of testing these kind of qualities rather than the qualifications which you present on paper. So that's one of the things that I would recommend.
All right, thank you. So we have there are quite a lot. So there's one that is saying, I think you had opted to answer this live. I'm not sure if you're the one who chose from the anonymous attendee on the vulnerable groups.
Yeah, trying to find it.
So I can read it out to you. He's saying, or he or she is saying, my worry with vulnerable groups such as players from war-torn countries is that the FIFA Football Tribunal does not seem to have any special emergency jurisdiction to override certain procedural requirements when access to documents or legal support is impossible.
We do. In fact, these are situations that I'm handling every day. So we have people transferring from Ukraine, from where else? From the Middle East, from even from South American countries. So these are the kind of cases that I deal with day to day. They do have emergency procedures, but what happens is if your member association is not aware of how to make that application on TMS, you are unlikely to get help. However, every FIFA member association has a FIFA TMS manager who has been trained in knowing what kind of information to retrieve and input into TMS. So yes, the FIFA Football Tribunal does have special emergency jurisdiction to override, for example, the need for an international transfer certificate for people who are from countries which are war-torn.
Yeah. There's another one that I'm seeing you've been typing the answer.
Yes. On agents, when a player's contractual dispute is directly caused by poor or predatory agent advice, why is the agent rarely joined as a co-respondent before the tribunal? Should this change? Should players seek relief against agents? Actually, the FIFA Football Tribunal does have a football agents chamber. Whether or not it is currently operational is yet to be seen, but the chamber exists for such kind of situations. So the issue would now be operationalize that chamber to handle such kind of matters.
Yeah, thank you. So, to be honest, I mean, all the speakers can see the question. There's some that are quite lengthy, and I mean, I think unfortunately, because of time, I don't know if they're framed as comments. So, to Juliet, there's one saying, is there a mechanism in determining how consent is obtained before an athlete joins a club or signs up, especially the vulnerable? Also, the issue of unjust enrichment discussed. We have a trend of athletes training and winning races, but their spouses are coaches and managers. It becomes a matrimonial dispute, and it's said that the athlete suffers more because of illiteracy, lack of records and evidence. What intervention is Sports World or AK having? I don't know, anyone, all I can mention the task force on the gender in sports. So, but Sarah, please go ahead.
Yes. So I discussed this with the Sports Disputes Tribunal specifically, and we were discussing how can we have in-camera proceedings for such kind of matters, so that if your sports organization does not have either proper enforcement mechanisms or simply the person who you are reporting is involved with abuse, or it's a matter which is directly related to your sports life and not your personal, Disputes Tribunal act as an independent body to receive in-camera urgent orders that can be listened to and ruled upon within a day. So it's something that we have been in discussions with. Right now, the SDT is yet to bring in new judges, but once they're in, we hope to pick up that discussion.
Yeah, and
And
as we close, yes, do you want to add on to that? Because I wanted to give you another question. Okay.
Yeah. I just saw the question on consent, and I think that's what I wanted to add and say. Usually, athletes, players generally have, especially those who are approached by potential clubs and potential federations, you find that many times they are disadvantaged because they don't have representation from an agent, and that is where the problem begins. And so the issue of consent comes in where they don't know who is best to help them in such a case. And so they end up getting the wrong they end up getting the wrong piece of advice, which makes them then see the money given to them as a lot when it's actually not. So such players, as an agent, when I come in for such players, I always start by encouraging them first to read the contract alongside me, because at least as an agent, I'm also a lawyer. And let's understand the terms of the contract, which terms are meant to protect this particular person. And if they don't protect this player, then they end up making all these mistakes along the way. Number two, the agent's cut is well included in the FIFA regulations. So I'm not able to exploit this player through their money. But the remaining money is subject to exploitation by coaches and managers and every other person. So they end up being exploited, and then they remain with a very small amount, which is why it's our duty to inform them that this money will go into your salary, this amount will go into this, but this money is not meant for coaches or for managers, it's yours, right? There's that. And then lastly, financial literacy is important. So these players, even athletes who go outside and they win, they run and they win and they bag good money, unless they have the financial literacy around it, they are more likely to get exploited by their spouses, for instance. And this is why I try also to encourage federations to include even masterclass on financial literacy for players and other athletes, because I saw the question on what is Athletics Kenya doing about that. That will be something they should do. Because as an advocate, I can't again give a financial literacy class to an athlete. I'm not well versed on that, but they should be given. Again, especially for athletes who are illiterate, it's always important that they are encouraged to spend a bit of their money to teach themselves on language, so that then they're able to express themselves better and then they won't be exploited. So there are many ways in which they can be protected, and we as persons within the sports, it's our responsibility to enforce such things.
Yeah. And as we close off, and since we still have you here, so there's one particularly also on agents. I would like to give that to Caroline again. So the anonymous attendee again is asking, on agents, when a player's contractual dispute directly caused by poor or predatory agent advice, why is the agent rarely joined as a co-respondent before the tribunal? Should this change? Should players seek reliefs against agents in such cases?
Yes, I think I had, and I agree with what Sarah said. The agents chamber was established for such issues, but it's currently not active, which could be one of the reasons why. And then number two, the FIFA has encouraged countries that are subscribed to FIFA to establish their own national dispute resolution bodies, so that then they can solve such problems, which don't have to get all the way to FIFA. And so issues like those could have been solved locally. Especially as an agent, I can get sued in my local NDRC, because the NDRC we establish locally is, of course, it's for dispute resolution, and we can fix it in a way that it works for Kenya. And then once FIFA has approved, then it becomes operational. And that will be one of the ways in which such a dispute will be handled locally. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Caroline. So unfortunately, we are forced to close. I know we could go on and on on this webinar for the longest time, because again, it's a very pertinent one. The discussions are very crucial. But I mean, we have to call to an end for today. We hope maybe the ELS can give us another session where we can delve deeper into some of the areas that you've highlighted. So, of course, as we close, a few key takeaways stand out. That one, safeguarding in African sport might extend beyond children to protect all at-risk stakeholders. And secondly, governance without enforcement is just good on paper. Implementation, of course, matters the most. And again, on mega events must be planned with human rights at the core. We currently now have the human rights due diligence with the Olympic Games or IOC and the FIFA World Cup when it comes to hosting, bidding and countries to be able to put that into consideration as they qualify or they're chosen to host these games. So this should not be come as an afterthought. And again, lastly, we have the gender equity and athlete welfare and are not nice to have. They are fundamental to the credibility and sustainability of African sports. So once again, thank you to our brilliant panelists, Caroline Mwanzia, Anthony Atata, Timothy Kaja, and Sarah Ochwada for your insights, and to our audience for engaging so deeply. A recording of this webinar, I believe, is on YouTube already, as this was also streamed live. And the key resource links, I hope, may be shared with the registered participants later. So a change in sport is not a spectator activity. It's something we must all take part in. So let's go forward committed to shaping a sporting culture where dignity, safety, and inclusion are the norm and not the exception. So thank you once again, and see you next time. And thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.